Welcome to Planet America's Weekend Edition, coming to you from the Situation Room. I'm John Barron.
And I'm Licciardello, and we have a situation.
Leo the 14th. American Pope in history.
Obviously, everybody understands I was treated for depression.
The Supreme Court is allowing President Trump to implement his ban on transgender people serving in the military.
Thousands of American military personnel are facing dismissal as a Trump ban on transgender troops gets the all clear from the Supreme Court. We'll speak to one of those affected.
We're also going to look at mental health concerns for a US senator, Trump's new trade deal with Britain, and we have an American Pope. But first...
This week, the United States Supreme Court gave the clearest indication yet it will not overturn the Trump administration's ban on transgender people serving in the United States military.
We have breaking news. The Supreme Court has lifted a temporary nationwide injunction that had blocked the Trump administration from banning transgender people from serving in the military. The nation's highest court ruled along party lines 6-3 to reinstate the ban while the litigation continues in lower court.
The so-called trans ban was one of Trump's first executive actions of his second term. It was back in 2016 the then Obama administration first lifted an original ban on transgender people serving openly in the military. Trump reimposed that in the following year. President Biden reversed that ban again within days of taking office in 2021, and as of this week, the ban is back, pending more legal challenges. That means, according to the Pentagon, service members who have a current diagnosis or history of or exhibit symptoms consistent with gender dysphoria will be processed for separation from military service, i.e. discharged, i.e. sacked. The Defence Department says it only recognises two sexes, male and female. An individual's sex, it says, is immutable, unchanging during a person's life. All service members will only serve in accordance with their sex. Experts, however, say that is overly simplistic. Biologists say there is a larger spectrum than just binary female and male. Official figures suggest 4,240 American service members have a diagnosis of gender dysphoria. Independent research in 2018 put the number much higher. They said there are 14,000 transgender troops currently serving. And we will be speaking to one of them, Colonel Bree Fram, very shortly, Chaz.
Yeah, look, I've got to say, this executive order did seem to display a certain degree of animus towards transgender people, John. They say it's not anti-trans, they're just of the view that people with any kind of potentially distracting condition shouldn't be in the army, like, say, having an eating disorder or having flat feet. But some of the wording in that executive order suggests otherwise, to me at least. They write that adoption of a gender identity inconsistent with an individual's sex conflicts with a soldier's commitment to an honourable, truthful and disciplined lifestyle. And also a man's assertion that he's a woman and his requirement that others honour this falsehood is not consistent with the humility and selflessness required of a service member. Sounds a little bigoted to me. As for their claim that this isn't against trans people per se, it's just trying to keep out people who are suffering from gender dysphoria. This is their list of trans ban exemptions. 1, the soldier has to be stable in their biological sex for 36 months without clinically significant distress or impairment. 2, the soldier must have never attempted to transition to their gender identity. And 3, the soldier must be willing to serve in their sex assigned at birth. All 3 must apply. So that sounds kind of like you're exempt from the trans ban if you're not trans. This ban is even harsher than the Trump administration's first trans military ban, like 7 years ago. At least that one allowed currently successfully serving trans troops to stay in the military. It was trying to stop new trans people from joining the military. Having said all that, I do actually expect the Supreme Court to uphold this second trans ban, because while I do think that this isn't about trans people, just gender dysphoria argument is particularly weak. As the Supreme Court said in 1993, a tax on wearing yarmulkes is a tax on Jews. The fact is, the Supreme Court still does allow the military to discriminate if they want to. In 1996, it allowed the military to ban Jewish service members from wearing those said yarmulkes while in uniform. In 1981, the court required men, but not women, to register for the draft. So that is explicit sex discrimination that would be unconstitutional in virtually any other context. But the courts show extraordinary deference to the government in matters of national defence and military affairs. So you take those precedents, John, and then add in the details of this particular ruling this week. They basically allowed the military to sack trans people, not just now, but throughout an entire appeal to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. Even if the trans people win that appeal, they'll stay sacked all the way through another appeal to the Supreme Court until a potential victory there. Basically, they've ruled for trans people to be sacked from the military for at least the next 12 months, regardless of what happens. So that suggests to me the Supreme Court is preparing to reject their arguments.
Yeah, it does seem very much that way. For more, we are joined by Lieutenant Colonel Bree Fram, who is on active duty in the United States Space Force, based at the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. Colonel Fram is an astronautical engineer, an 18-year veteran of the United States Air Force, and the highest-ranking transgender person in the US military. She is speaking to us in a strictly personal capacity. Her views do not reflect those of the US government, the Defence Department, or indeed Space Force. Colonel Fram, welcome.
Well, thank you for having me.
What would you say are the implications of this ban now coming into effect?
Well, there's going to be a wide-ranging impact that is both immediate and has long-term implications. Because right off the bat, we are going to see lives and careers disrupted for transgender individuals as the process begins to work to push us out of the service. And even though the cases are going to continue through the lower courts in order to rule on the merits of the issue, the policy of the government will come back into force, and that policy says that we are not fit or suited for military service in any way, and that we are going to lose our careers, despite the lower courts already pointing to the fact that our service is Exhibit A for the fact that we meet all the standards, and that the government doesn't even necessarily know who we are and would have to go searching through medical records to try and identify transgender individuals.
Now, Colonel, the administration says that trans people being in the military could compromise unit cohesion and readiness. Is that what you found when you came out as trans?
Well, when I was able to come out for the first time, the day the Secretary of Defense announced open transgender service in 2016, I sent an email to my colleagues as soon as he was done speaking. Though it did take me a minute because I was worried about how my life was going to change. But after I hit send, I ran away, basically. I went and found the gym buried underneath the Pentagon. I hopped on the elliptical machine, and I went nowhere, faster than I'd ever gone anywhere in my life with all the nervous energy. But when I got back to my desk, I sat down, and my colleagues walked over to me one by one, shook my hand, and said, "It's an honor to serve with you." And I was blown away. The honor was mine to work with such amazing people, because the value of people being authentic is a gift. It is a gift not only to the individual to be able to be the best version of themselves, but when they can then dedicate that energy that they had spent hiding who they are to the relationships around them and the mission, that's important for the unit. And I think my experience, by and large, was replicated by transgender service members all around the world. We earned the trust and the respect of our colleagues, and that's what made a difference, because we proved our competence and that we were there for the right reasons.
I suppose, Colonel, it's one thing to have that sort of experience there at the Pentagon, but what about frontline combat roles? Would that be any different?
I really don't think so. And we have transgender individuals serving in every role. We have transgender members of the Special Forces. We have transgender infantry officers. We have transgender people in tanks, in fighter jets, on ships at sea. There is no job that transgender people don't serve in, and they excel. In fact, I'd argue that in many cases, they do better than their peers because they know all eyes are on them, and they are working twice as hard to prove that they belong, given the roller coaster of policy that we've been through.
Now, the administration say it's not bigoted to exclude people struggling with gender dysphoria any more than it's bigoted to exclude people who are depressed or have flat feet. Gender dysphoria is a condition that could stop someone from giving their best, and so the military just isn't the place for them. What's your response to that?
Well, the first thing I would point to is 10 years, nearly a decade of open service for transgender individuals who have met the standard, or in most cases exceeded the standard. And so with that evidence, what conclusion can you draw other than we are capable of performing the duties the military has assigned to us? And we have done so not only here at home station, but deployed around the world in the most demanding of situations. As I already mentioned, we fly our nation's most advanced fighter aircraft. We command ships at sea. We penetrate adversary networks. We do everything the military demands of us, and we are in fact better individuals, better at our job when we are able to be authentically ourselves. There are thousands of transgender service members who have absolutely done everything this nation has asked of them and more for nearly a decade.
Colonel, you continued to serve through an earlier reinstatement of the transgender ban in the first Trump administration. How was that possible, and is it possible again?
Well, there's a pretty dramatic difference between the policy of the first administration and the current policy. The first time around, it was a ban on anyone coming into the military who was trans, and it was a ban on anyone new coming out and receiving care in the military and being identified as trans. But there was a clause in the policy that allowed the approximately 1,600 of us at the time who had come out during a period of open service to continue serving. And there was also an issue that they could have cut us should one of the courts found that our example of service was a reason to find the policy discriminatory. But we never had to make that point because by the time the courts were about to rule, it was a new administration, the ban was lifted, and trans people could serve openly again. This time around, though, it is that ban, but it is also a purge. It pushes out the many thousands of transgender service members currently serving, in addition to turning off access for new recruits and others to come out as trans.
Now, the military say that trans people can serve if they've been stable in their biological sex for 36 months, if they've never attempted to transition to their gender identity, and if they're willing to serve in their sex assigned at birth. But in reality, would any trans person meet those criteria?
No, not without a time machine. It is impossible for an open transgender person to meet what is claimed as a waiver criteria.
Colonel, just as one's gender is an important part of any individual's sense of identity, so too for many people in the armed forces, that is a big part of their identity too. How is this going to impact people who now find that those two parts of their identity are at odds with each other?
The effect, I believe, that transition and a journey to finding one's authentic self and showing that to the world has is truly making you the best version of yourself you can be. Because transgender people are not saying, I'm broken, please fix me. We're saying, I've looked inside myself and I know I am not the best version of myself I can be, and I'm going to reach for that. And that's the kind of attitude and mindset we should want, not just in the people that we know, but particularly in our military, in people, in units, in organizations that are constantly striving to be the best version of themselves. And I mentioned it already, when someone is authentic, when they are not spending that mental tax, putting energy into protecting who they are, that energy can then be rededicated to the relationships with the members of their unit and to the mission. So this is simply a group of people who said, I can be better, I know who I am, and it's an honor to do that alongside our military colleagues.
Finally, Colonel, on a personal note, you've served faithfully for over 20 years in the military. Do you feel betrayed?
Well, right now, I'm heartbroken because I know so many incredible service members who have given years or decades of their lives to this nation. I know people, friends, colleagues, others who have just had the chance to see us once or twice and have their stereotypes shattered of who we are. And I know the impact that's made. I know the contribution that's been made to national security. And so I'm sad that that may not be recognized. But I'm also hopeful because our experience is there. The record of our service is there. And people are going to be able to look to that and to say that we gave everything we had. We thrived in the most difficult of circumstances. And we proved year in, year out that transgender people belong everywhere.
Colonel Bree Fram, thank you very much indeed for joining us on Planet America.
It was a pleasure to speak with you.
Now to concerns being expressed over the health of John Fetterman, the Democratic Senator and former Lieutenant Governor of Pennsylvania. You'll probably recall Fetterman suffered a near-fatal stroke during his 2022 election campaign. He stayed in that race despite problems with his speech, movement and processing auditory information, memorably using voice-to-text technology during a campaign debate against celebrity doctor and Republican rival Mehmet Oz.
And let's also talk about the elephant in the room. I had a stroke. He's never let me forget that. And I might miss some words during this debate, mush two words together, but it knocked me down, but I'm going to keep coming back up.
Fetterman cuts an unlikely figure for American politics. 6'8" tall with tattoos, preferring hoodies to those suits. He went on to win that election, but his recovery since arriving on Capitol Hill has not been easy.
Tonight, we have learned he has checked himself into Walter Reed Medical Center, where he's being treated for clinical depression. In a statement, his office says, while John has experienced depression off and on throughout his life, it only became severe in recent weeks. Adding John is getting the care he needs and will soon be back to himself.
Fetterman was released after being in hospital for 6 weeks. He admitted to having had suicidal thoughts, but still, the senator seemed to be doing better for a time at least. Now, according to Adam Gentleson, his now former chief of staff, Fetterman has spiralled out of control. Gentleson wrote to Fetterman's doctor in May last year that he was worried, quote, if John stays on his current trajectory, he won't be with us for much longer. Other unnamed former aides have described Fetterman's volatile and concerning behaviour and that they are frightened to be in the senator's presence if he's in an amped-up mood. Their concerns were first raised in an article in this week's New Yorker magazine written by journalist Ben Terrace. Terrace saying that former Fetterman staffers are, quote, troubled and they are sad. These were some of Fetterman's truest believers and now they question his fitness to be a senator. Terrace also disclosed that he is a friend of Gentleson's. Meanwhile, Fetterman himself has dismissed this article as a hit piece, saying he is doing fine.
It's like now he's had a weird grudge. And he has threatened to do this for quite a while. And if you're really concerned about someone, you could say, hey, let's sit down, can we talk? It's not like going to the media. And that's why somebody that has an agenda, it's like a hit piece.
Senator, you've been public about your struggles with depression, and you had a prescription regimen of drugs to take in the aftermath of your time. Have you been keeping up with that, taking your medication?
I want to. My doctors are like, John is great, and I am on all of the plan that it's always been, and it's incredibly invasive. And why are people talking about anyone's personal medical things? It's that, I think most people would agree that's really, really invasive.
If the former staffers do have a weird grudge, as Fetterman puts it, it could be because he has changed. If not his health or his personality, his politics. When he was running for office, he courted the Bernie Sanders progressive wing of the Democratic Party, but since coming to Washington, he has taken some increasingly conservative stances, always pro-Israel. Since the October 7th, 2023 attack on Israel, he has become more conservative, mostly on Israel, but also on a range of other issues. So, is that what this is really about? And is the implication that his mental and physical health issues have changed his politics? Although he wouldn't be the first politician to change their opinions once they win office, health or other concerns to one side.
Yeah, look, I mean, there are some attention-grabbing anecdotes in that piece. maybe he is depressed. Maybe he's a difficult person who just alienates those around him.
Some accounts of him being quite befuddled in meetings with the likes of former Senator Sherrod Brown, running out onto a street, almost being hit by traffic, being in a bit of a daze. So some things that you could say would be concerning.
Yeah, I'm not saying there's no concerns. But what I am saying is that, number one, we can't know for sure what's going on.
Absolutely.
Okay, that's the first thing. Second thing is, I'm not sure that any of this is relevant. The man is not running for president. He's not even running for the Senate. He's got 3 more years in his term. He's certainly compos mentis enough to be a senator. They've had some 120-year-olds in the Senate sitting there just rotting on the bench. He's certainly performing his job. I agree with him. It's invasive. I agree with him that it's intrusive. And I think using, as the centrepiece of your piece, a letter written to a doctor expressing private medical information is cheap and tacky.
Yeah.
I really didn't like that. And I don't like them medicalising political differences, which is what is going on.
What we really need to see is not the staffer's letter to the doctor, but the doctor's letter about Fetterman's health. I think that is a valid question, just as it was valid to ask questions about Joe Biden's state of health, and indeed Mitch McConnell, Dianne Feinstein, anybody who is showing signs of age or infirmity. There are reasonable questions to ask, but we certainly don't want to be getting back to a stage where a period of mental lack of health, such as a 6-week hospitalisation for clinical depression, is enough to disqualify you and make you vulnerable to these attacks, which, you know, it could be a two things that are true at once. Yes, he's had some struggles, but also people like Adam Gentleson thought he was going to be more of a lefty than he's turned out to be.
Especially given we don't discourage people from being open about these things. He should be rewarded for being open about his depression, not punished with these kinds of pieces. Also, there's a very easy explanation for why he's taken more conservative positions than Adam Gentleson would like. The man is the senator for Pennsylvania. Right. It is a very purple state. His positions are perfect for Pennsylvania. He'd be more likely to win re-election in Pennsylvania than Adam Gentleson. I promise you that. I think this, honestly, this is just about Israel. These guys don't like his Israel position. And I think that if we should just take a step back for a second and look at what Fetterman was like before he was the senator, before he had a stroke, back in 2022. Back then, he was saying, whenever I'm in a situation to be called on to take up the cause of strengthening and enhancing the security of Israel or deepening our relationship between the United States and Israel, I'm going to lean in. The relationship is a special one that needs to be safeguarded, protected, supported and nurtured through legislation and all available diplomatic efforts in the region. And then he conceded, I'm not really a progressive in that sense. There's no daylight between myself and these kinds of unwavering commitments to Israel's security. He's always been an Israel hawk. That was back in 2022. I imagine what happened on October 7, 2023 probably made Fetterman even more passionate about Israel. Sure, I also suspect that those differences of opinion on Israel could create differences of opinion on other related issues. Let's say, for instance, Iran. Just this week, Fetterman tweeted out, "We cannot negotiate with Iran. It's time to destroy their nuclear program and neutralise the remaining capabilities of its proxies. I remain steadfast with Israel, provide whatever is necessary to carry that out." Now, that is an unusual view for a Democratic senator, but it's an example of how Fetterman's view on Israel can separate him further from other Democrats. I think that is what's going on in this case.
Yeah, the piece in the New York Magazine also talked about how Fetterman basically just watches Fox News now. He even wanted to vote for the confirmation of Pete Hegseth as Defence Secretary when Hegseth was, just squeaking through by that. But again, he wouldn't be the first politician to change their political positions. Arlen Specter, a former senator from Pennsylvania, was a Republican, became a Democrat during the Obama years, was crucially important at passing stimulus and healthcare and a number of bills. So we could see John Fetterman, before his time is up in office, caucusing with the Republican Party, particularly if this stuff keeps coming out. Interesting, though, that this whole question of who determines their fitness. Does it matter if a senator is not fit? Well, if they're appointing people that may or may not be qualified, I guess there is a reasonable question to be asked about that. But currently, there's not even a 25th Amendment equivalent which can remove a dysfunctional president from office.
Even this article doesn't suggest that he's been compromised when making decisions. No one's suggesting that. I just don't think that that's relevant to this. And I come back to the same point over and over again. One word, Pennsylvania. He's just representing Pennsylvania. That's what he's doing.
Yeah. Well, there is a lot happening around the world at the moment. Not surprisingly, a lot of what is happening runs right through the Oval Office of the White House. After months of market uncertainty over President Trump's sweeping global tariffs, there was an announcement of sorts, a trade deal of sorts between the US and the UK.
So good for both countries, and we'll also receive new market access for American chemicals, machinery, and many other industrial products that weren't allowed. And they'll end up getting products that they'll be able to price, and if they like them better and we make great products, they'll be buying those products, but they were not available in the UK.
So while this is still light on details, this draft agreement does promise greater market access, removing some non-tariff barriers, including things like for American beef into the UK. The 25% tariff on UK steel and aluminium goes, but a 10% across-the-board tariff on UK exports to America remains in place. Symbolically, or perhaps just coincidentally, this announcement came on the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II in Europe. British Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer wasn't in Washington in person, but of course there's always the speakerphone.
Mr. Prime Minister, please take it away.
Thank you, Mr. President, Donald, and this is a really fantastic, historic day in which we can announce this deal between our two great countries, and I think it's a real tribute to the history that we have of working so closely together.
There was a bit of a collective head scratch from the markets after this. Up a bit, encouraged, no doubt, but far from jubilant. This is pretty low-hanging fruit, and there is still plenty up there high in the tree. Meanwhile, America has its first pope, or the world has its first American pope, but either way, Chicago-born Robert Prevost was elected Pope Leo XIV, earning him congratulations from around the world, including this from the Chicago Cubs baseball team and from the President of the United States, who said he looked forward to meeting him. Quite gracious, considering the amount of time that Trump and his supporters have spent in the last week or so posting AI-generated images of Pope Donald I, including this one, which I quite liked, of orange smoke announcing his fictional election. Russia Today shared that on Twitter as well. I wonder why. Trump clashed frequently with Leo's predecessor, Pope Francis, on issues including immigration, their relationship, and Leo's willingness to comment on American issues as an American who also spent a lot of years working as a missionary in South America. Is going to be fascinating to see. Leo, Chaz, is just 69 years of age, so he'll potentially be around a lot longer than Donald Trump. Only term limits on popes are generally enforced by God.
Meanwhile, there are some strange things happening in the Middle East, John, even strange by Middle East standards. Firstly, the Houthis in Yemen, who have been firing rockets at ships recently in the Persian Gulf, seem to have had a sudden change of heart.
We had some very good news last night. The Houthis have announced that they are not, or they've announced to us at least, that they don't want to fight anymore. They just don't want to fight, and we will honor that, and we will stop the bombings, and they have capitulated, but more importantly, we will take their word.
That seems strange. They coped through devastating attacks from Saudi Arabia using American weaponry for like 6 years, the Houthis, and now they just give up out of nowhere. Reporters asked Trump for more information, and things got even stranger.
Can you tell us a bit more about the deal that you've reached with the Houthis that you mentioned?
No, it's not a deal. They've said, please don't bomb us anymore, and we're not going to attack your ships.
And where did you hear about that?
It doesn't matter where I hear it. The very good source, I could tell you. Very, very good source. Would you say, Marco? I would say pretty good, right, JD? A very good source.
Well, that was enigmatic, John. Who could he possibly be referring to? There's such a good source, but presumably isn't the Houthis themselves, otherwise he would have just said it was the Houthis.
Iran, Vladimir Putin.
I don't know.
Somebody on Truth Social.
Your guess is as good as mine, but talking about strange news from informed sources, 5 sources supposedly told Reuters that America would be leading a temporary post-war administration of Gaza. And this transitional government, headed by a US official, would oversee Gaza until it had been demilitarised and stabilised and a viable Palestinian administration had emerged. What could possibly go wrong, John? Establishing an Iraq war-like occupation of Gaza until peace is at hand, no one's fighting, Palestine's ready to take over. I'm sure that'll be any day now. But, especially when we consider the recent history of America's involvement in Gaza. Do you remember this?
Tonight, I'm directing the U.S. military to lead an emergency mission to establish a temporary pier in the Mediterranean on the coast of Gaza that can receive large shipments carrying food, water, medicine, and temporary shelters. No U.S. boots will be on the ground. A temporary pier will enable a massive increase in the amount of humanitarian assistance getting into Gaza every day.
No US boots on the ground, John. Well, we found out this week the full extent of what exactly happened to that pier from a Pentagon Inspector General report. In the end, that pier cost $230 million to set up, but it was only operational for about 20 days before it completely fell apart. At the time, the Pentagon said that 3 US troops suffered non-combat injuries while supporting the pier's construction and maintenance. Turns out the actual number of injured troops was 62. No boots on the ground, hey? And they only distributed about a third of the aid that they were meant to distribute. So not exactly a stunning success when America messes around in Gaza, John.
Not so far. So, plenty to talk about. Joining us to do that is Edward Wong, diplomatic correspondent for the New York Times. He's also author of the book At the Edge of Empire. Edward Wong, welcome to Planet America.
Thanks a lot. It's great for me to be here.
So we have our first American Pope. I wonder, how significant do you think that is, and how important will his relationship with the American president be?
Looking back through Pope Leo XIV or Robert Prevost's recent record, he's already pushed back publicly against some of the Trump administration statements. For example, when J.D. Vance made a fairly controversial statement about what the Catholic Church teaches ordinary citizens or practitioners about who to love, who to trust, the circles of love. He pushed back publicly against that on social media and said that Vance was wrong. So I think that what we'll likely see is this Pope also taking public stances on these issues that are priorities for the Trump administration, including migrants, immigrants, the Trump administration's efforts to deport them. I think my guess is that we'll see this Pope speaking up on issues like that and challenging the administration's point of view.
Edward, do you get a sense that the new Pope is a political man? And if so, how much of a player could he become in the American scene?
You'll see the argument among many people that the Pope is a political position in many senses. It's become more so in the modern era. And so I think that, the statements he makes will be seen in the political context of various countries around the world, especially ones with large Catholic populations. Obviously, there's a lot of cultural issues that are at play right now in the United States and elsewhere, and that ranges from the attitudes towards migrants and immigrants to abortion and women's rights to gay marriage. And so I think that we'll see this Pope being asked about these issues. Pope Francis took certain stands on them. In some cases, he took ambiguous stands. And I think that more traditional Catholic figures and believers in the U.S. Criticized him for that, criticized Pope Francis for that. And we'll have to see how they react to this Pope as he makes his statements. And I don't, we don't know what positions or statements he'll take on these, but we do know that he generally comes from the same ideological lineage that Pope Francis comes from. And many people think that he'll carry on much of the work that Francis has started.
And what did you make of the AI-generated images and videos that we saw of Pope Donald Trump Did you read anything into that, or was that simply Trump and his supporters just trolling his critics?
I did see some reactions, including from some Catholic leaders here in America who objected to it. President Trump's vice president, J.D. Vance, who is a converted Catholic, said it was all just a joke. I've seen some people put forward the theory that it's a form of Trump goading his own Catholic followers, like people who voted for him, and saying that I can go ahead and do something so out of bounds like this, and you'll still support me, or you'll still stay in my fold. And that in a way, it's a form of exerting power, not necessarily over Catholics at large around the world, but exerting a form of power over his own followers. And we know that Trump himself is not a religious person. He's probably skeptical of people who are devoutly religious in some ways, just because he doesn't have a history of practicing it himself and not following the ideals of any religion. And so I think that in a way he could be just trying to express a form of dominance over people that are his followers, are religious, and that he sees as people who won't stray from him no matter how far he goes.
Now, if we go to the Middle East, Edward, are you putting much stock in these stories of America potentially taking over the management of Gaza, a la Iraq? Because that does sound a lot like what Trump proposed a few months back. I'm not sure anyone would expect that to end well if it did happen.
Yeah, Trump did suggest that. He promoted that, that image on social media, the AI image of Gaza being remade into kind of a Las Vegas style resort strip. Obviously, people were trying to figure out what he meant by that. So far in the administration, no one's advanced any concrete plans that moves America closer in that direction. We do know, it seems that within Washington here and in the halls of power in the White House, that there is some skepticism of Prime Minister Netanyahu. The Americans, I think, around Trump and Trump himself are somewhat skeptical of the Israeli Prime Minister, of what he wants to do with Gaza, of him trying to draw America into a bigger role in the Middle East. I'm not convinced that President Trump wants to put American troops in Gaza, for instance. I think that he ran on a platform of keeping American troops out of wars in the Middle East. And I think that he knows his advisors and will tell him that things will end badly if he puts American troops in Gaza. So I'm very skeptical of the notion that he will do that. He might allow American private security companies to take contracts and put Americans in Gaza. That could also lead to problems because we saw American private contractors killed in Iraq, and that sparked harder American military intervention in certain cities in Iraq. So that could end up being a slippery slope. But I do think that Trump right now is skeptical of American military involvement in Gaza, as well as American military involvement in other parts of the Middle East, like if there were a war with Iran, for instance. I think he is cautious about Iran. He is somewhat wary of the Israeli Prime Minister's inclination to perhaps launch a military attack on nuclear sites in Iran. And I think he wants to try and do diplomacy with Iran first to see if they can reach some form of nuclear deal, similar to what Obama did and that Trump withdrew from, before he greenlights an Israeli attack on Iran if he ever decides to do that. We've seen the American military carry out this bombing campaign, very intense bombing campaign against the Houthis in Yemen, which is an Iranian-backed militia. But in the last 24 hours, there's been a call for a ceasefire of that from Trump. And I think that's tied to the diplomacy with Iran.
It seems, Edward, as though there's sort of a coin spinning at the moment. On one side, it says a nuclear deal with Iran. The other side, it says war with Iran. Do you have any sense as to how that coin might be about to fall?
One thing, having worked in the Middle East and having reported on the Iraq War from the ground for 3.5 years, I try not to make predictions on exactly what will happen in the Middle East. It's a region that constantly surprises people. But I do think that right now, the strong trend in the administration is to try and get to some agreement with Iran through diplomacy and not enter into a war with Iran or not be led by Israel into a war with Iran. I think that if there were a war with Iran or there was military action against Iran, the way it would likely start, at least from the point of view of American officials, is that Israel would want to do strikes on these nuclear sites in Iran and ask America for help and for support in those strikes. And I think that's where President Trump and his aides right now are. That perspective is met with some skepticism right now by President Trump and his aides.
And Edward Wong, can we get your thoughts on this framework of a trade deal between the United States and the United Kingdom? Did it seem a bit half-baked to you? I mean, Keir Starmer was literally phoning it in.
Right. I mean, when you look at the numbers, going into a trade negotiation, Britain really doesn't make sense because the U.S. had been running a trade surplus in recent years. Last year, I think that surplus was in billions of dollars, maybe $12 billion, if I remember correctly. And so you have, it's one of the few bilateral trade relationships where the U.S. is running a surplus. So it doesn't really make sense to open up all these aspects of trade for renegotiation with the UK. So I think a lot of people are interpreting this as more of a show, a sort of trophy victory that Trump can claim because he has to start saying he got deals with various countries. And he says, we have tariffs on the UK. We'll keep them at 10% for most products, but we will give them exemptions on certain products, including automobiles and some products from some other industries. And he says that the UK is opening up access for things like American beef, ethanol, and some other exports. So in a lot of, he didn't go into detail. The British government has not gone into detail on any of this. So I think that it was the two sides rushed to put together some form of announcement. And maybe they need to work on details and maybe they don't. Like it's not clear because it's not clear to what degree this deal is substantial. But we know that there was no need for a large-scale renegotiation of the trade relationship between these two countries.
Edward Wong, thanks for joining us on Planet America.
Thanks.
And Edward will be appearing at the Sydney Writers' Festival later this month. That's all for Planet America's Weekend Edition. We'll see you back here at the same time next week.
And we'll be in the Situation Room as well on Wednesday night at 9 p.m. on ABC TV, over YouTube and Facebook. See you there.
Bye-bye.